Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Hello, everyone. My name is Bilal Aftab, as you mentioned. I work at Stripe, which is not a private equity firm, it's a technology company. But I do work with our largest and most strategic partners, which includes private equity firms and a number of other platforms. And so thank you all for being here today. I have the honor and privilege of moderating this panel with two incredible individuals that have done a very, I can't even begin to describe how much they've done for really bridging that gap between US and Pakistan, and in particular helping drive the rise of startups in Pakistan. And so it's my honor to introduce Mamoon, Hamid, and Aatif Awan. I'll let them introduce themselves as we get going, but please give them a round of applause.
These three?
These three? All right, yeah. Let's do it. All right, so thank you both for being here, and thank you, everyone. So let's start off with the classic interview question. Tell us a little bit about yourselves. What brought you here, and why you're here today?
You want to go?
Sure.
Okay. I'm Aatif Awan. I'm the founder of Indus Valley Capital. We're an early stage VC fund focused on Pakistan. I've been doing this for the last 2 to 3 years, and the first couple of investments were Airlift and Bazaar, both Pakistani startups that have gone on to raise more than $100 million in VC funding each. Why I'm doing, it's interesting. I didn't think I'd be doing that like 3 years ago. I was VP of Growth and International at LinkedIn, leading their growth, and decided to take a year off in 2018 because I'd spent 7 years at LinkedIn, and I wasn't sure what exactly I wanted to do next. And what happened is that I spent a good part of that year in Pakistan and spoke with founders who reached out, people made intros, and realized like what a potential Pakistani startup ecosystem had. And like prior to that, 13 years in the US, I went back every year, but never thought about it. And most of us didn't. And then it didn't make sense that VC was going into all over the world, MENA, Egypt, Indonesia, and wasn't happening in Pakistan to the extent, but felt very compelled to move back and start an early stage fund and then help create this bridge between Valley and Pakistan.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for having us. Really an honor to be here. I was telling Bilal earlier, I think the first open forum I ever went to and spoke at was in 2004. So this is like 18 years later. But what a great forum itself and great organization. So thank you for having us. I grew up in Frankfurt, Germany, to Pakistani parents. Actually, I was born in Pakistan, but really only spent a few weeks there. And moved to Silicon Valley as a 19-year-old engineer. Worked here for 6 years as an engineer and as a product person, and then I decided I really wanted to get into venture capital. So I went back to business school, and then in 2005, I got into the world of venture capital, and I've been doing this now for 17 years. I'm a partner at Kleiner Perkins, been there for 5 years, and I invest in early stage technology companies, and in the last year, started to invest in Pakistan only because I thought there was a tremendous opportunity, and we'll talk about what the opportunity is to invest in Pakistan, which happens to be the title of this whole forum. But yeah, it's like I said, invest in early stage companies that are great founders with some really strong market tailwinds that allow really iconic companies to be created. Kleiner Perkins, the firm that I work for, has been doing this for 50 years, and along the way have come companies like Google and Amazon and Genentech, and we think in those terms of the types of companies we want to back are the ones that really become iconic history-making companies, including in Pakistan. And I think there's an opportunity to build those over the next 10, 20 years. And so we take a very long view on this stuff, but happy to talk more about it.
Yeah. So you've both had storied careers in the US and have now started investing in Pakistan in the last couple of years, as you mentioned. Can you tell us about your first investment in a Pakistani company and the story there? Mamoon, we'll start with you this time.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we made our first investment in Pakistan last year. It's a company called Tajer. And it was, there's a bit of a funny story behind it, because about 2 years ago, my wife is a physician, but she also likes to invest in startups. And she works at a startup herself. So she went from being a doctor working in the hospital to going into tech and healthcare tech. And so 2 years ago, she goes to YC Demo Day online because it's just at the beginning of the pandemic. And she said, hey, like, I just heard this pitch from this Pakistani startup, and I decided to meet with them. And it seemed like really great guys. And it goes in one ear, comes out the other for me. And it's like, yeah, why would you invest in a Pakistani startup? Like, it's like, why would sort of very much dismissed it. A year later, someone approaches me, a European investor in London who invested in the seed round of Dodger, coming right out of YC. And I was like, oh, this seems interesting. The concept seems interesting. How about I'll take a Zoom call? And I do a quick Zoom. And I said, these guys are amazing. And then I tell my wife about it. I met this cool Pakistani company. He's like, I think that's the company I told you about a year ago. So I'll tell you more about, the company itself just made a ton of sense. And the founders actually are both returnees, educated in the US, went to school here, worked here, and then, are building this company called Dodger. How many people have heard of the company? I wouldn't be, you probably shouldn't have if you live here. But it's a company that provides, it's a distributor / wholesaler of consumer packaged goods. So they have these large warehouses across different cities in Pakistan. They deliver goods to local mom and pops who then, offer those goods to their local constituents. So, there's millions of these small mom and pops, and Dodger services these mom and pop shops with both products as well as financial services. On a daily basis, they're delivering close to 10,000 orders to these little mom and pops. And it's about, I think, 1,000 plus employees at this point. So 2-year-old company though, or let's say, I think 2.5-year-old company. I just thought that, consumers have to live, and they buy goods and they buy them every day. And these, the local mom and pops are the lifeblood of the Pakistani economy. And so it just made a ton of sense to back a company like that, that was just at the very basic level, applying some technology to serve, a large part of the population of the country.
Thanks, and Aatif.
I met Dodger founders. They're really, really awesome founders. And I think like one of the things that this B2B marketplaces have shown in Pakistan, people would have this question about, will people use technology beyond WhatsApp and YouTube? And what's amazing about the whole B2B segment, where there are multiple startups like Dodger, Bazaar, Retailer, is that they've all grown very, very fast. And the users who are using this technology to actually run their businesses, they are these small mom and pop retail store owners, and they've been the first to adopt that. So that's been very, very exciting to see. Our first one was Airlift, as I mentioned. This in part was, they motivated me to start the fund, because Usman, co-founder, CEO of Airlift, was one of the early founders that I spoke with. And he worked at DoorDash, drops out of INSEAD early 2019 to move back to Lahore to start a startup. So you could see that early trend of, look, a lot of founders will see the same opportunity in Pakistan and come back and build these things. And back then it was a mass transit business. That's what they started with. And what was really exciting was, the clarity of thinking, how ambitious the vision was, and actually a focus on solving these problems. I was meeting all these people, and everybody seems to be complaining about, it's hard to find talent in Pakistan. And the first conversation was like, here's my plan to go and make my first 10, 15 hires. And I was like, this founder sounds amazing, but I'm still thinking about this. 2 months later, he reaches out. He's like, I have co-founders. I have a founding team. We've built, the app and tech and backend. And by the way, we're live and running these buses. And I'm like, things don't happen at this speed in most startups, that's globally benchmarked, very, very fast execution. So we ended up very excited about that, and led the seed round. And then interestingly, COVID hits and you're building a mass transit company, right? So you cannot put 15 people in these vans in the middle of the COVID, and very prescient, one of the things that Airlift's founding team has done well is been able to predict where the world is going. And in April 2020, they realized that COVID was a multi-year event. And back then, if you think about it, it wasn't clear, it wasn't obvious. So suspended that business. They became a quick commerce and a great, turnaround story as well. And then went on to raise $85 million Series B, the largest round in the country. So been very privileged to back them, and learning a ton in the process.
As Mamoon mentioned, you've been coming here since 2004. I think the recent uncles probably made me volunteer when I was in high school or back in the day. But we've been talking about the rise of Pakistani tech for a long time, right? But it seems like in the last couple of years, we've really hit an inflection point. You're seeing very large rounds. You're seeing global funds like Kleiner come in. What's different this time around?
So there are two things that, like really changed around, 2017 to 2019 that enabled this rise now. So if you go back to, let's say, 2013, and you ask, look, why did startups not happen, VC not come in 2030, Pakistan had 3 million broadband subscribers. You cannot build a massive company with that sort of internet user base. In 2018, that number crossed 50 million. Today, that's 116 million internet broadband subscribers. That's a very critical ingredient. You look at India, you look at Indonesia, like you need that foundational element. And the second reason, more specific to Pakistan, was in the post 9/11 world, we had a real security situation because of the war in Afghanistan, and that got fixed around 2015 as well. And then it took a couple of years of perception, but I think both those things enabled some amazing founders to come and leave their other career opportunities to go and build something exciting in Pakistan. It also brought the early VCs, and I think we really started this to take off in 2019. So first round capital that Airlift's Series A round, and first round capital celebrated investor, early investors in Uber, Square, Notion, Roblox, don't invest outside the US, right? So of the 500 investments they've made, only 10, I believe, are outside the US. So them taking a bet in Pakistan made people pause and think about it. Process followed, investing in Baikia, then Mamoon, has done now 2 investments. The Tajir investment was a big moment in the ecosystem, and people, again, like Kleiner also doesn't invest that much internationally, right? So that then built on top of each other, attracted even more founders, more VCs. Tiger Global came in. They have now done 3 investments. And I think since then, the opportunity has become much more obvious, much clearer, and that flywheel is working pretty well now.
Yeah, maybe just to add, the most important question we ask ourselves when we back a company is the why now? Why should this company exist now? Why these people? Why this market? Why this product? And the question here is why Pakistan now? And I think Aatif really articulated the why now. I'd say for a US-based venture firm like Kleiner Perkins that I'd say only invests, let's say, less than 10% outside of the US, and most of that is in European companies. Very few in Asia. There has to be, why are we doing this? And I'd say it's what you just mentioned, 100 million broadband users now, a burgeoning middle class. I think more than half the population is under the age of 18, having grown up with the internet and on mobile devices. And so it's just an attractive demographic to go after. And I think the biggest point you made is about just post 9/11 and the perception change over the last few years, that maybe countries like Indonesia helped. Like Indonesia, a bigger country in terms of people than Pakistan, but at the same time, 10,000 islands that are all kinds of different people and types of cultures, whereas Pakistan is one contiguous landmass of mostly similar people. So way easier to do probably business in a country like Pakistan and Indonesia. Indonesia has a number of decacorns at this point, and lots of unicorns. So why can't Pakistan, where it's like the rule of law is there, we have a really great legal system, lots of things can be improved, but at the same time, lots of things that exist that actually make it a pretty good country, and people speak English largely. There are lots of really good reasons to actually do business in Pakistan and invest in Pakistan. And I think we look at other countries. I'll go back to Indonesia, where it seems like it's a bit a harder country to have gone after, but yet there's a lot more valuable companies there, tech-based, that are thriving and doing well. So why not Pakistan?
And for what it's worth, Stripe also invested in a company in Pakistan a few years ago called SafePay, and really with the same thesis in mind that you all mentioned: incredible entrepreneurs, incredible growth opportunity, and a really captive and growing middle class. You mentioned sort of the rule of law and the recent, and the government. There have obviously been some recent changes. Does that impact the startup scene at all in Pakistan? Should folks be worried? What do you think about that?
Not a whole lot, I would say. So if you look at the politics of Pakistan, when it comes to economic policy at large, and particularly in tech, this is not the Democrats versus Republican, where you have massive changes and you're seesawing between them. All political parties, they're very, very supportive of bringing more FDI. And now they see that actually technology startups is a great way of doing that. They want to enable an environment where that can happen more and more. There's very easy access to all corridors of the government, regardless of the political party in power. So all the way up to the prime minister, it's not hard. Prime Minister Imran Khan, actually invited a bunch of startup founders, directly on their own initiative. Several ministries have seeked out proposals. And I want to call it the role of regulators in particular as well, which was another enabling factor. So both at SBP, State Bank of Pakistan, and SECP, there have been some amazing, developments over the last, few years from regularizing this holding company structure. So one of the things that happens is in most emerging markets, you have a holding company in a investor-friendly, familiar jurisdiction like Singapore or Delaware, and then operating companies are in Pakistan. And that was happening anyway, but the SECP and SBP quickly regularized that. And then on top of that, enabling regulation for fintechs, including like fully digital banks, and having licensing process for that, doing sandboxes for really innovative fintech ideas like fractional ownership of real estate, which you'd think that in a market like Pakistan, regulations are difficult to change, but I think that the regulators have come up with new ways of testing and enabling that. So, and we feel that will continue regardless of the change in the government.
The commonly used saying in startup world is like the only constant is change. Pakistan's like a great startup. The only constant is change.
Yeah.
And it's not in a bad way. Like, Aatif said, it's again, like the rule of law and like largely speaking, like everybody wants the same thing, which is startups and technology and for us to get ahead. And, but, with political regime changes at all times. So I don't think there's actually a big effect on the startup ecosystem, what founders can build, what consumers will buy. That happens in spite of like political regime changes. So I don't think it has that much of an effect. And I would say I actually went back to Pakistan for the first time in 15 years a few weeks ago and spent time with some of the regulators that you mentioned and really amazing people in government. I would say like, we do have very talented people across the world that have gone back to Pakistan, gone back into government and done amazing things. And I think that happened in the last Imran Khan regime, and I think it will continue to happen because I think people do have a high level belief that Pakistan can thrive as a country over the next 50 years and be one of those like really special countries in terms of growth.
Now there is, also some economic challenges. So I think like the political stuff actually doesn't matter that much, but we do have a macroeconomic, balance of payments issue, which tends to be recurring. And then usually you have to go towards IMF and other countries to just address that. And we're in the middle of, another one of that. Last one was in 2018. Now, the point I would make is, it does make some things harder. But again, if you go back to first principles and think about what the opportunity in Pakistan is, it is about, bringing a very large economy with a massive consumer spending online, right? So we're at 1 to 2% of consumer spending is online. You have a $350 billion GDP. As that goes to 15 to 20% over the next decade or 15 years, yes, the economic growth would help, but the bigger factor is this transition to online. And I think like that, there's no stopping that. That's happening, and it's happening at a very, very fast pace. And from that perspective, we feel very excited about opportunity regardless of the short-term economic challenges at the macro level.
Tell us about the founders, the individuals that you meet with and that you're funding. What are their stories? What are their backgrounds? What gets you excited about them?
Yeah, I think Aatif mentioned Usman over at Airlift, and you meet someone like him, and he has a tenacity, has thought about the problem more than anyone else in the world probably, and has built something and hired a small set of people to help him build it. And so I would say the quality is as good as any founder that we would back here. Whether that's Usman at Airlift, or if it's someone like Babar and Ismail over at Dodger, or some of the other founders we backed. And that is actually a true sign of the ecosystem. Some of my colleagues invested in China early on, maybe 20 years ago. And at the time, it was, and we all know what's happened in China and the startup ecosystem in China over the last 20 years. It's like the number of amazing companies like Alibaba and ByteDance and Meituan and JD.com, like the list goes on in terms of amazing tech companies built in China in the last 20 years. But they were all returnees, people who had been educated here as well as had worked at companies here and took that talent back to Pakistan. And I think that's sort of the first wave we're seeing in Pakistan right now is these highly qualified individuals who worked at some of the best companies here and were as good as any founder here in the United States. And now they just happen to be in Pakistan and building something in Pakistan?
Yeah, so I think that tends to be a pretty common profile, again, in the context of emerging markets, because early on, people who have seen how high growth startups are built and have that experience have an unfair advantage, right? And they tend to do better. So a lot of time that tends to be people who have worked abroad in another startup ecosystem. So that's what we saw with Airlift, with Bazaar, which I mentioned earlier. One of the founders used to work at Snapchat, and then Kareem. The other was ex-McKinsey, and they come back again with the idea of, here's a problem we're excited about, and we can build a massive company. Went on to raise, 70 million Series B recently, led by Tiger Global and Dragoneer. But one thing that's interesting is, I think while early on you have to, probably those are the founders you'll bet on, I think there is a transition happens. And I think like there are also, if you're not very mindful of this dynamic and just start looking for that, then you miss out on some great founders who are going to be, actually maybe didn't go abroad to study or work, but we're starting to see that transition as well. And I think like Kareem's role here has been really, really incredible as well, where Kareem, MENA-focused company, 3 billion exit to Uber, but a huge element of it was Pakistani talent as its DNA, starting from Mudassir Sheikha, who's the CEO and co-founder, but at all levels, right? So a lot of the founders who worked in Pakistan or MENA were Pakistanis. So we are seeing a lot of early founders having that. And then now we are seeing that next transition where a bunch of people, left Airlift to go their own startups, right? And we're going to start seeing that across the board. And that's very, very exciting, because now you're multiplying that number of founders, a lot of them, just with the local experience, having seen that playbook and then going and saying, look, actually, I'm more excited about this problem. I've learned a bunch. Thanks, but now I'm going to go and do my own thing. And we're starting to see that now.
Everyone jokes there about a VC saying, walking around, how can I help? But I think you two are both incredible investors. Tell us some real life stories of how you've actually helped and supported your companies that you've invested in.
The comment you're saying is like VCs are like glorified recruiters. And that's true in large part because, we invest typically very early when it is a great founder and maybe it's earliest, semblance of a product, and they need to hire people, to build more product, go to market. And so a lot of time early on, post-investment is spent trying to convince smart people to come help, join a company. And so part of it's interviewing, part of it's selling. And I think that's, if I look at my last week, I probably had like 4 or 5 of those conversations where I'm, whether I'm interviewing someone or just actually just trying to convince someone to join a company because they're looking at us, hey, you just put $20 million into this company, why? And you can explain why. And they're like, okay, well, that makes sense or not. And so I would say a lot of what we do is like glorified recruiting. And I can be more specific about it, but that's kind of every week.
You can be as specific as you want, but it's very important. Hiring is tough in any environment. How about you, Aatif?
Yeah, definitely talent is like the biggest problem that most founders have. So definitely help with that. I think like in our role, because the ecosystem was so nascent, there are like a bunch of different challenges. So my background is consumer product and growth. So I'm a sounding board for that. And it's founders show and the teams build it, but you're on call. So if they want to discuss an idea, just to do that. But we've also played a role in the fundraising, and I think that's very, very important because you're trying to create this bridge. You're trying to convince other VCs like Mamoon to come and lead rounds. So building that network. So specifically like in Airlift's case, the first round. So helping make that intro back channel and doing that, and most recently with Tiger Global and Bazaar. And a fun one on that front is, I once cold emailed Mike Moritz at Sequoia, introducing a portfolio company, and he's just so amazing. I mean, he's a legend. He doesn't need to be working hard at all at this time, and he responds in a few hours and takes that call with the founder. They didn't invest, but that was really fun to do.
Well, not everyone has an investment fund at their fingertips. And if you look around here, we have a lot of really smart, talented folks that work at some of the best technology companies in the world. What are things that the folks in this room can be doing to help startups in Pakistan, to help bridge that gap between here and there, and really just help foster the ecosystem even more?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'll give you an example. One of the companies that I work with, need some help like building their first real true financial model. And you know, I actually leaned on someone here who's done this for some really great technology companies, and he happens to be Pakistani, and said, hey, like, could you just help them think through building their first sort of like real financial model, plan for the year, the next build a 3-year plan. So he's doing that right now for one of these companies, and actually happens to be doing it for a couple more in Pakistan. And even considering moving back to Pakistan, or moving to Pakistan, because he thinks it's actually interesting to go work on Pakistani startups at full time, pick one of these companies to work on full time. So I think back to the point of learning from here and applying those lessons elsewhere. There's lots of people here who have a lot of talent, who are not necessarily moving back, but are interested in helping some startups. So raise your hand, reach out to us saying, hey, like, I'd like to help with like, growth or biz ops or finance, and just maybe help and maybe be a consultant or get some, advisory shares for doing the work. That's one way of doing it without investing in a company. There's ways to invest. I think every YC class now has a bunch of Pakistani startups in it now. You can choose to invest in these companies as well and also help them. And so those are a couple of different ways of working with Pakistani companies.
So I love the example Mamoon gave because it's so specific, and it's a very much needed help that most startups will do it because those founders are doing it for the first time. And I think the challenge with a lot of the advisory conversations is they're very open-ended in general. So you'll have that great first conversations, and then it fizzles from there. So actually picking a very specific skill and then saying, look, I can help, and through the process learning more and more about the Pakistani startup ecosystems, I think that's a great strategy. I feel there is a lot to do, right? So now you have Pakistani startups hitting the scale where they can actually hire people who want to move back and actually pay them very, very well, both on the cash side and the equity upside. So that's one. Like if you've been thinking about moving back, and a lot of have done that over years because of family reasons, I think now is a great time to engage with people and start that exploration. The second one is the advisory that Mamoon talked about. And in terms of investing, I feel so Pakistani startup ecosystem, like we had a fantastic, year and a half. Last 12 months, I think we've raised like $500 million. A lot of it that tends to be, larger, more established rounds. So even like what people call pre-seed, it will be like $1 million round with some VC involved. But I think there is a gap at that true angel pre-seed round where you're taking true risk. And being rewarded for that as well. So I think from that perspective, whether it's looking for YC companies in Pakistan, whether it's building relationships with local VCs, with VCs in the Valley who are investing in Pakistan, saying, look, how can I look at companies earlier? And we have Kulsoom and Misbah here from I2I, so find them and, just build those relationships and then say, look, who should we be talking with? Become part of that diligence, come in early on. And I think it's just a start. So if you look at any ecosystem's arc, and compare that, what's happening in India now, actually the ecosystem started taking off back in 2005. So like 17 years later, you get to that point with this unicorn being minted, every week or so. But we are very much in that first innings. So it's very exciting to have as many of you involved as possible.
That's something we've studied a lot at Stripe for what it's worth, and everything you mentioned is spot on, where you want to study and see where startups are coming up. But one thing we've absolutely noticed is there's a very strong connectivity with wherever they are, usually in India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Israel, wherever they might be, a very strong connection to other strong tech ecosystems. And there's a very strong connectivity between the diaspora there and the folks back there. And you don't have to work at a big tech company to do that. What I found actually to be helpful with some startups I've talked to is sometimes just letting them know, hey, what you're doing is really hard, right? And so from that perspective, what do you think is harder to do? Start a company in Pakistan or start a company here? What's easier about it? What's harder about it?
Kulsoom says Pakistan, yeah. So I think starting a company is really hard in general. It requires a lot of sacrifice. Biggest sacrifice probably the time you spend with your family, your immediate family, if you have kids. So it is all consuming. I was with a friend yesterday who's a startup founder, and we're having a little thing with our kids, and he said, it's like, how's your weekend? He's like, well, I'm getting flying up to Oregon where the rest of my team is to spend the next, like Saturday afternoon, flying up to Oregon and spending the next 5 days inside of a conference room in a small hotel in a small town in Oregon as they work together to build a company that they build together remotely in a hybrid way. But to me, that's a sacrifice. Like to leave on a Saturday afternoon with 3 young kids at home where you think that the weekend is just as much work as it is, like, you know, to him, the concept of weekend doesn't exist actually, right? So that to me is a sacrifice away from your family. So whether that's here or whether it's in Pakistan, you know, when I'm on a Zoom call with the founders in Pakistan, it's like usually like midnight or 10 p.m. or they're just like having to rush out of dinner to have a Zoom call with the U.S. investor. These are all sacrifices, and I think it's not easy. Being a startup founder in general is very hard. It probably is harder in Pakistan because you have a lot more constraint on the capital and talent. But in general, just it's a commitment, and that's why, you know, we test for that commitment when we invest in founders. Is that, you know, it's not going to be easy, and this is like not for a very select few people who can actually stomach the type of work that goes into and the challenges and ups and downs, like a market like this that we're in right now, and get through it. So it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, I would say it's different flavors of hard. Like starting a startup is never easy. It's a very long commitment. You'll have different challenges. So in Pakistan, you know, like fundraising is way harder. And I think like one of the things is we had an excellent year and a half, and that kind of skews the perspective. But like as you get into those next levels of raising rounds, like every round is hard, and with the global markets just changing, I think it became way harder. So that's going to be a consistent challenge. I think some things interestingly are easier too. That would be much harder to US. So doing what Bazaar and Tajir are doing, for instance, you know, like in the US is a much harder thing to do. Yeah. So operations you can do more easily in Pakistan. You know, the labor costs tend to be cheaper. Similarly, like the quick commerce model, it's very interesting when you compare those companies in emerging markets versus the developed markets. You know, there's labor cost differentials. They do enable some very interesting opportunities and very fast growth trajectories as well. So I feel like that balances out. And then given where Pakistani startup ecosystem is, I feel both from a reward perspective, you know, like it's just a bigger opportunity because the kind of problems you're solving, they are very core, you know, like you're talking about food and shelter. So on the hierarchy of needs stuff, you're solving some very compelling product. And the impact angle of that is so much higher, which makes it not easier, but makes you going, right? Because there is a larger reason than just the financial return for you doing it. And then that, in a way, like if you can align yourself around a mission and hire people around that mission, then I think it just makes it more worthwhile.
So we'll have a few more questions and then we'll open up for Q&A in a bit. What makes you most optimistic?
I think the founders that I've talked to, they're fearless. I think the country, actually, you go to Pakistan, you're like, people are fearless, actually. Mm-hmm. And they have a desire for growth. Like I feel like there's a lot of a growth mindset. At least, you know, again, I haven't been back in 15 years. Especially for Pakistan, it's like this kind of fearless mentality of where, you know, there's Allah pe chhod do, you know, it's not like that. It's like, yes, you leave it, but you actually do something about it. Yeah. The combination of the two is very potent. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like what makes me the most optimistic is, you know, the youths of Pakistan. I think like there is a huge generational shift when your median age is 22 years. And then people underestimate that, and I underestimated that before I moved back to Pakistan and started engaging, you know, at that deeper level, is because there is, I think Mohsen Hamid talks about it, that, you know, like when you move, you know, as an immigrant to a different country, you kind of get stuck in, you know, your nostalgia of the country, even though the country has moved on. So you think the country is more conservative than it is in Pakistan's case. Most people do. We think that things are harder or impossible, you know, like because if you grew up in 90s or even early 2000s, that was the reality of it. But now, like, I think like people who were born, you know, like post, 2001, the internet native, they grew up on that, they see what's happened in the world. They are not, you know, limited by those things, you know, like, so they're fearless, they are ambitious. And I feel there's a whole change of guard that will happen in the next 20 years. And, you know, it's probably starting at the startups in tech, but it will enter politics. It will enter all spheres of society. And that's what makes me very optimistic about Pakistan's future.
So we'll do a quick lightning round before we open up for Q&A. So I'm going to ask a question and then just 1 or 2 word responses, all right? And this might engender some conflict, but let's see. Favorite Pakistani city?
Lahore.
Islamabad.
Okay. Favorite Pakistani food?
Nihari?
Jalebi.
Aatif wins this one. Favorite dish at Zareen's?
The silver spoon roll.
So Nihari on weekends and chapli kebab other days. Right?
What Netflix or streaming service series are you watching right now?
I'm finishing up The Dropout.
Good one, yeah.
Ozark?
Okay. Something you learned or a new habit during COVID?
Working out more.
So this might be cliche, but I've gotten super comfortable with making investment decision without having meeting founders. So even now when I can meet, like I'm like, actually, we really don't need to meet. Let's spend as much
person,
time.
You mean?
In person.
Yeah, you still do Zoom call.
Yeah.
You still meet them over Zoom.
Yeah, in person.
Well, with that, we'll open up for Q&A. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you for the nice conversation, very informative. My name is Jawad. I'm with the startup Ukaz. So I want to ask a question because we have our respectable ambassador over here. So having done so many investments in Pakistan and looking at the investment regulations in other countries, what would you like to see from State Bank of Pakistan and SECP to change in order to have foreign investments coming more easily to Pakistan? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll just start off. Actually, the government of Pakistan has actually been very open to the dialogue between the tech world, and in fact, like when I went to Pakistan, the ambassador's office set up time for us to meet with the chairman of the SCCP, the chairman of the state bank, so just for them to understand our points of view. So this is like, I think, as good as it gets to have access through our government to the highest level officials for us to bring in foreign direct investment, for them to understand why we invest in startups, what motivates us. So I think that dialogue already exists, and they want that. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's right. As I mentioned, there have been a lot of encouraging developments, regulations changing, that dialogue is there. So I feel pretty good about that. In general, I think the government's role, the most important thing is to provide overall stability. So both in terms of law and order, economic stability, right? And then those actually do more than any particular regulation can do. And the rest, I think the private sector is pretty well equipped to take on.
Sabina, I think you had back there.
Just a second, it's actually not on. Can you hear? Great. This is Conways. I work for Motive, formerly Keep Trucking, and I'm in the process of starting my own company, SaaS-based product. And I wanted to ask you, since you've been investing a lot in Pakistan, what are the top 3 things that you would like to see in founding members that gives you a lot of confidence to be ready to invest?
Yeah, I'll happy to take it. So, I think we talked about Usman, founder of Airlift, and how much tenacity there is, the true desire to solve hard problems, and then to actually build. Like, ideas are a dime a dozen, as we all know, and it's all about execution. So you look for that, you test for those things when you're meeting a founder, and sometimes it's like you have a few weeks to decide whether they have it, and so you talk to people who they worked with before, do a lot of references, and also spend a lot of in-person time to test that. Are they tenacious? Will they make sacrifices? Will they? Are they thinking about the problem in a very clear way? And are they going to execute and solve those problems? By hiring people and being very dogged at execution.
So we invest super early. A lot of the weight is on the founder part of the equation. And the why founders are doing that, we like to go into detail into that, because that's what tells you if you're going to stick through for 10 years, and that's very, very important if you want to build any meaningful company. So being mission driven, that's super important. That also helps you inspire others and hire. So we look for that, like, will you be able to build teams, bring others along? And then the third thing is just speed of learning and execution. So even though, so for Airlift and Bazaar, and both we invested when they were just like 2 to 3 weeks into operations. So you can't like put that in a spreadsheet and analyze, like it's meaningless. But what you can see is like how far they've come since starting with the idea of doing this to actually having the team, and then week over week, actually what they're learning about the insights about the problem, as well as building it on the ground. So that's a very useful signal of where they'll end up being, like in 2 years or 10 years.
Three more questions.
Okay.
Nina has one, then two, and then the other.
Okay.
I think I can be loud enough without a microphone. I just had a question around talent, right? You know, we're not problems here. Folks that I'm hearing started back on. So how are you building that pipeline?
Yeah. So outside of specialized talent, I would say, like it's probably harder with this global market stuff. Actually, maybe we should talk about that in a question, the impact of that. But like talent was very, very difficult to hire in the Valley. I think in Pakistan, the challenge wasn't so much, it's getting more competitive, but it's, actually hiring for potential and then giving people that challenge. So as an example, when Airlift, like scaled out of Pakistan right after the series being to South Africa, you had a 26-year-old going to South Africa and like having never visited, having not even knowing the basics about the country and saying, hey, connect me with like 10 people who I can help, and building that. So it's a lot of about it is potential and people putting them in that situation. The specialized talent, I feel that's where we do need a strategy, and that's where this audience and people who worked here can be very helpful. So as you go to the higher engineering management, as you go towards biz dev, corp dev, finance, because these companies are quickly scaling. And if you have a company that's doing, like $100 million, $200 million in top line, like quickly you need that leadership bench. And I think like that's where the solution probably seems with attracting this talent from overseas and bringing that back to Pakistan.
Maybe we can quickly touch on that. The change in the markets. What does that mean for startups in Pakistan?
Mamoon?
Yeah, in general, I think even right now, markets in the U.S., like later stage, growth stage capital is pretty much down to zero right now. A lot of the crossover investors who had been investing for the last several years in growth stage companies, they also have public funds, and they are down 50, 70, in some cases, % on their public funds, which allows them, makes them focus on that part of the business and make sure that they can come out of that. And also just dries up capital and opportunity, and even just mind share for other things like late stage growth. So I think it is close to shut at this point. Very few companies are fundraising. If you are fundraising, you're really, what would take 2 weeks is taking now maybe 4-6 months. And that's definitely going to have its effect on Pakistan and investments there, because again, like it's all about like mind share. Like people are just dealing with the problems they're facing right here. They're going to have less time to dedicate to emerging growth opportunities in Pakistan. So I think we're in for a tough year ahead.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, Pakistani startup ecosystem is so nascent, right? So if you start the clock in terms of really predictably growing, you started at 2019, and you've just seen this up into the right curve, and especially last year, like that was phenomenal. And now we are seeing our first massive challenge, and it is pretty hard. If it's hard here, emerging markets tend to take even more of a hit. And I think from that perspective, like we'll have to navigate that very, very carefully, and transition from that growth to profitability mindset. And that's right now top of mind for a lot of local founders and investors.
So I think as you touched, that right now you guys have invested in startups that have here. But however, I'm a founding member of Inspire Pakistan. We have helped dozens of startups in Pakistan, and many of them started by passionate people, greenfield, and really targeting a specific area, very high success. What do you recommend? On one side, in Inspire Pakistan, we are helping channel to bankers and advisors among the overseas Pakistani or into those Pakistanis. But what would you recommend that really over the next 6 months to 12 months that's for such startup as a high potential local founders and obviously in Pakistan?
Yeah, I think we covered it earlier. It goes back to figuring out what areas they need help with. And I think we need a lot more efforts to bridge the talent abroad with startups in Pakistan. And it sounds like you're doing great work. And I would also encourage, I think like there are multiple communities now. So I talked about the VC funds, but there is Pak Launch, which is a pretty large community of Pakistanis. So just there's obviously Open, who's done a tremendous job over the years. And I think we all just need to do more stuff together to figure out all those areas of help and, like engage very actively beyond the events, on an ongoing basis. I'm happy to, discuss more offline.
All right, well, that was our last question, or do we have one more?
I have one more question. Hi,
All right.
my name is Lorraine, and I'm with Unity Tech. Thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation today. I wanted to ask you, as a female founder, you see there's a huge discrepancy between female founders getting funding versus our male counterparts. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see the market is, or especially VCs, bridging that gap? Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a debate here in the U.S. It's a debate in Pakistan. How do we make sure we're funding female founders? Actually, I've invested in 2 companies. One of the other company that I didn't talk about, the founder happens to be a female CEO. And I did a couple of lunches in Pakistan when I was there, brunches with a bunch of founders. And it seemed like the representation of female founders as female CEOs was probably higher than it was actually it would be in the US. So a number, and we're talking about 10 to 15 founder CEOs in a room, having lunch together. So it seems like representation is actually maybe even better. It's not where it should be, where it's 50-50, right? But at the same time, I think I'm finding that females are just as likely to start a company in Pakistan as they are over here, if not better, which is a good signal in itself. But we have a lot of work to do to get to 50-50 at least.
I think there's a lot to fix there. In Pakistan, what's interesting is if you look at startup ecosystem at the leadership level, we had some incredible women, like showing the way for a long time. So Jahara, who was Pasha's president, and then ran an accelerator and ran one of the best startup conferences for multiple years, Disrupt. Kulsoom, has been supporting Pakistani startups for over a decade. She's done some amazing work through her accelerator, through the insights, and now VC fund along with Misbah. And there are others as well. Unfortunately, at the founder level, I think that gap is pretty bad. In my view, there are 2 things that change that, and it's similar to why nobody was investing in Pakistani startups, and then they started to do is you start to see those early success stories. And I think those success stories and representation and seeing that then pulls other people to do it. Right now, if women founders' odds of raising money are way less than men, then a lot of really smart women won't actually want to do it, right? That's the rational thing to do. But once you have those success stories, I feel like that will start to change. And VCs tend to pattern match, unfortunately, and it's very shortened cycle and all. And I think that will also start to change. So from our perspective, Fund 1, we have 9 portfolio companies. 3 of them have at least 1 woman co-founder. 1 is all women, not enough. But the hope is you can do more. And I think other idea I've had, which maybe, as you think about pre-seed, I feel like the problem you need to solve at pre-seed. So having a pre-seed program where you can actually say, look, we are going to make a very strong effort to say, look, half of our startups should have a women founder. And at that scale, the check size are small enough. I think it's easy to orchestrate something like that. And you'll see very meaningful results, I think, if we did something like that.
Actually, it's not a question. It's always a question that is asked, what can Pakistan government do? Me, Mamoon, all of them monthly meeting with the president of Pakistan, initiated by the ambassador of Pakistan, attended by at least 5 ministers, many secretary level. So, governor of State Bank of Pakistan, I do not know any country in the world. I have worked in many countries in which the president of the country has the time once a month to listen what we can fix in that country.
And yeah, we should give a round of applause to Naveed Bhai, because he's actually really orchestrates this and helps us get this group together. And that is, I completely agree with you. The reason why I was able to talk to some of the people I did is because of this forum that we have is that you've been a key part of. Thank you.
All right, well, with that, thank you so much, Mamoon and Aatif. Really appreciate your time, and thank you all of you for listening and for your thoughtful questions. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, man. Of course, no, thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.